Bye.
All right, so let's get started. Rinki, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah, Rinki's on our board of advisors, and she helps us think through what CISOs need and what they're up against currently. Rinki, maybe give a little background on yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to be here. I am currently the Chief Information Security Officer at Bill. I lead security and IT here. Prior to this, I was the CISO at Twitter and the CISO at Rubrik before that. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for almost 2 decades now, and I sit on a couple boards and also advise several startup companies, including CyberSync. So very happy to be here.
Great, Rinki, thanks. And I'm Patrick O'Reilly, founder and chief of product. Today, we're going to talk about the SEC and what they came out with recently and how it might impact organizations, the role of the CISO, how it's going to translate to the board, to the C-suite. What are the broader implications of the new rules? So before the official vote, Rinki, that the SEC took just a couple months ago, how were security and business leaders talking about and preparing and perceiving what the new rules might look like?
Yeah, I think everybody's heads down right now in reviewing kind of what's been announced by the SEC, and I think there's a lot that folks are considering. One is at the board level, that what does this mean for board members in terms of what they're now liable for, what they need to be looking out for, what the right questions that they should be asking, but also internally right now within organizations. Everybody's looking at CISOs are partnering with their legal department to look at how did this apply to us? What do we need to change in terms of our security program, in terms of our incident response playbooks, in terms of our crisis management, and looking at this end to end. And how do you report this up, and looking at things like the financial reporting and how the cybersecurity incidents will play into that, who'll sign off on that. And so there's kind of a relook for bigger companies on how do we make sure that we're staying ahead of this, and what it might look like.
Awesome. So how do you think CISOs, people in your role, are responding to the new rules and the relationships with boards in light of the new regulations? What do you see your peers doing at the moment?
Yeah, I think they're, like I mentioned, I think they're all going back and they're looking at partnering very closely with their legal departments on how does this apply to our program, and what changes do we need to make right away, and then relooking at reporting. How we used to report security incidents, right, everybody has their policies and standards, and many companies, many of us are already abiding to a lot of regulatory bodies depending on what business that you're in, and so we have requirements. Some of us might already be fulfilling what we may need to do, but with some of the new reporting requirements, everybody's looking at, okay, let's go back and look at many of the incidents that we've had, and did the way that we used to report, is it still going to be the same going forward? And then I think just in light of certain security incidents that we've currently heard of, right, some of the breaches that have happened, and how regulatory bodies have come back and really are looking at executives within the company personally. I think there's a lot of work going on there. That are we making sure that things are going through the right approvals internally and there's the right people signing off.
Right, exactly. So there's been a lot of talk about how this changes things for the board. What is their level of involvement expected to be? What is their level of expertise expected to be? But as a board member, can you highlight some aspects of the recent rules that are driving board members in particular to take a more active role in cyber?
Yeah, I think one of the things is it's been kind of all over the place, right, on whether or not CISOs should report incidents to the board or not, right? And and like my rule of thumb is you should, and there should be transparency around that, and to what level. And are boards prepared for crises? Do they know what role that they personally play in lieu of a cybersecurity breach or an incident? And then are those incidents being properly reported up and in a different way than we used to report up, right? And so I think some of the rulings around that cybersecurity incidents in a timely manner need to be part of kind of the financial reporting that happens, that will need to have 8Ks associated with it. All of that, I think board members need to, one, be aware of these SEC rules that have come out. How does it impact the business? What's their responsibility in it? And so a lot of board members, like a lot of us as CISOs, are partnering with legal, and let's make sure our board knows what these changes are, how they impact our business, what we need to do. But then let's even go through maybe some practice scenarios with boards. And you're hearing more and more board members actually wanting that let's go through cybersecurity breaches, and let's have a simulation or a practice incident, that so that we know what role then we play, and let's kind of real time do training. And I think you're hearing more and more boards and CISOs come together to drive that kind of thing. And I think it's actually a really nice thing that's happening, because it's bringing awareness where it's not just these security teams that are driving and holding all the risk on their shoulder, that now I think there's more thought around how do we broaden exposure to the risks that are there within the company, and make sure that that not only is going out to the executives in the company and there's ownership around risk, then how do you bring that all the way up to the board level with the right lens, right? Because you don't want to bombard them and inundate them. And so I think a lot of board members also are coming back and wanting to learn.
Excellent. So you would say that the regulations have increased engagement and sort of driven a desire to understand a bit more about cyber focused matters.
From what I've seen, yes, and I hope that's the case across the board.
Yeah, excellent. So as cyber threats continue to evolve, and evolve they will, how can boards effectively balance their strategic oversight responsibilities with the technical complexities of cybersecurity?
Yeah, and I think it's important. Of course, you're going to give data. There's always data that you bring back up to the board to show kind of what is the effectiveness of your controls. Have you met your goals in terms of the security program and the maturity, and bringing them kind of making them aware of that and bringing them along on that journey. But I also think it's just important to have a real conversation. Like, board members and CISOs need to just have a real conversation. Like, Rinki, what are you worried about? Or what keeps you up at night? And are you getting the support you need from the executives, and having that open dialogue, whether it's in the boardroom or it's one-on-one sessions with board members, and board members also asking how they can support CISOs in the right way. And that can go a really long way. And then, of course, them asking what role can we play? And I think that's the most important. I think it's really keeping it at a business level is really important. Of course, you want to give them reading material around the program, and what I mentioned, metrics that and dashboards that you agree on with the board members that are right for them to see. But I think then it's also important to take that step back and focus on, like, what are you worried about? What are the incidents you're seeing? Is the program effective? What's happening in the industry? It's similar to what's happening. So those conversations need to happen. And I think a lot of times we focus as CISOs on the board content and the deck, but I think it's the conversation that's more important. And a lot of board members, I hope, are asking, like, what should we be asking you? What are the right questions? Even though you have these controls in place and the maturity in place, is it possible that we still have a breach? And those types of things I think are important. And are we prepared to respond to that?
Right, right. I was just on a session where a lot of the conversation was around, when you go into the boardroom, you might be, excuse me, showing them some metrics. You might be showing them, some of your framework maturity. You might be suggesting certain things that would remediate or buy down certain risks. But ultimately, it's the story that matters, and that's a conversation. So it's really good to hear that from you. Do you have any examples of some successful collaborations between CISOs and board members in implementing some strategies under this new framework?
Yeah, I think I was on the flip side as a board member. I was on the board of ForgeRock before the acquisition just went through a few weeks ago. And being a part of that, one of the things, of course, the CISO came and presented very regularly to the board, and then even more frequently to the audit committee. But then we had that one-on-one session as well. That was on a sometimes we would meet as needed, sometimes on a monthly basis, and would talk through kind of what are we, and it was interesting because I was not just a board member, but also an operating CISO, sharing best practices there, that how are you going to implement the changes? And they were very much thinking about that. He was meeting with their legal department, meeting with the right folks in the company to get their program changed, just so that they ensure that they're adopting some of the rules from the SEC. And that was super meaningful. And I, again, as a practicing CISO, regardless of these new rules that have come out, it's been very valuable to meet with the board members on a regular basis, regardless of the companies I've been at, to hear what's top of mind for them and answer the questions and have those real dialogues outside of the boardroom, then leading to very effective conversation, very, very meaningful conversations in the boardroom.
Excellent. So in the context of the changing regulatory landscape, what strategies do you recommend in implementing cyber risk management under the new framework? What are your big strategies? What do you like to implement?
I think what some of the key things, and I've heard that some companies are starting to think about this, but a lot of companies have cybersecurity committees. I think that's going to be a new thing, and I hope with that come more security practitioners on boards, because I think that that'll be an important component to have that expertise on the board. It's not just it's not just one voice. Now, I'm also hearing about companies going and doing cybersecurity advisory boards to support the CISO and things like that. So I think we're going to see a lot of those kinds of things that are happening. And again, this is all to support security practitioners out there. One of the things that I really like, I think, and I heard that there's a few other companies that are doing this I'm excited about, is we've heard about like internal risk committees and all these things, and generally they happen at a lower level. But now I'm hearing about executives that are playing a very active, regular role as a part of internal risk committees, reviewing risks across the company, not just in their department, and where there's approvals now on what it's folks contributing to, are we going to accept this risk or are we not going to accept it? And are we going to mitigate it in some way? Who's accepting the risk? And there's kind of a review board, and it's with very senior executives in the company that make that up. And it's documented, and it's, there's minutes from that meeting, just like it would be in a board meeting. And then the output of that then goes to the board, and you might review incidents with that board. You may review key risk areas. I think this is a part of the strategy that should go with every company. I think it helps the security program be stronger. It drives awareness and accountability across the company. And then it gives you really good material also, hopefully, to have discussions with the board as well. And the board then gets confidence that risk is being looked at the company, and there's a governance structure internally. And this is not just to do it for a show and tell, check the box. This is really meaningful part of the program, and there's no one requiring that you do something like this.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard that a couple of other places, but that's fascinating because that's sort of cyber risk maturing into the other risk functions within the company as well. So let's get down to a little bit of brass tacks. What are some practical steps that organizations can take to ensure alignment between cyber risk management efforts and expectations set by regulations like the ones we've seen come out recently?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's very important that you have the risk framework is broadly understood. It's like one of the biggest issues is when security folks have a risk register and they have this spreadsheet of long list of things that they're following. But I think it's important to have a proper framework around that. Make sure that accountability is well known. When there's a security incident, it's not just hush hush. It's the right people know. Bringing legal in very early on. I think process and playbook is so important, but then ensuring that people know what the process and playbooks are around this, people understand what the reporting is, that the right folks are brought in, and having kind of that crisis management playbook built out tactically, that at every layer folks know what their role is. And I think getting people involved in the risk decisions and the incidents. It's not just now security starting a war room and dealing with these incidents, that there's much more implication than that. And then when do these things make it up to the board? When do they require reporting externally?
Excellent. So I'm going to ask you now that, how can CISOs and cyber professionals effectively communicate technical concepts and risks to board members who might not have a deep technical background? How do you do that? Because to some extent, that's what we do over here with the product as well. You know, we have a top layer of the wedding cake, but everyone's got a different take on it. What's yours?
I think it's really important. Like if you can't just go into a boardroom and start talking about zero trust and that we're implementing YubiKey and this is what we're using. You have to make sure that there's a, like, when you, especially when you, if you're in, and you have this opportunity at your first board meeting to kind of story tell a little bit around, this is the program and these are the key risk areas that we've identified, doing a third party attestation against that to say, here's where a third party has identified the risks, but then showing that in order to reduce that risk, these are the programs that we're going to implement, and then having the technical details as that lay, so that they have that broader picture as to where the maturity is of the company, why you're doing certain programs that you're doing. And then it opens up the door where they can actually ask questions. They don't need to know the technical details to ask that, is YubiKey going to help? You know, they can say, okay, you're doing an identity and access management program that's going to help you reduce risk around certain areas, and then know where those are lining up. And I think then they can ask the questions that, is that truly reducing the risk? Are there areas that you might be missing? And I think opening up that dialogue. And so a lot of that is, do they understand kind of why you're focusing on the things you are? Do they agree that the risk areas you've identified are the key risk areas for the company? And just having those dialogues. And then when you're reporting, I think, security incidents too, I think the outcome of that is more important. That, how did it hurt the business if it did? What did you learn from that? How are you improving the program, or how are you implementing things, technology, people, process, to go and improve and ensure that this doesn't happen again? And then showing progress over time. And I think those things, you know, again, I think keeping technical jargon as much out of the boardroom as possible is better. And then, of course, having those one-off where, if, you know, board members should be asking that, hey, I have questions, I didn't understand this part, maybe we can take that offline, and having those dialogues there. It's an ongoing dialogue. It's not just presenting to the board once a quarter or once a year or whatever the frequency might be. This has to be an ongoing conversation. And then it's not just with the board members, it's also with your executives, right? That they should know, and they should be able to speak confidently and represent as well. Usually the CEOs of companies are in the boardroom. And so they should be able to say, yeah, I can speak to that to some level of depth.
Excellent. Yeah. And, you know, there's so many different things in cyber, and there's a whole sea of technical terms and acronyms, and, you know, a lot of it's very valuable, but it needs to be translated across. So from your perspective, what are the most important metrics or indicators or modes of communication you can use that boards, should be mindful of to assess the effectiveness of the cyber risk management efforts?
I think the board meetings are one. I think the CISOs having open communications, like checking in with board members regularly, is another. I think like sending even a link to a board member to say, hey, I'm following this just so you're aware. Let me know if you have questions, things like that, in the more informal back and forth as well. I think there's like products that can help, right? And I think this is where CyberSaint and other companies are really leading the way on how can we provide a standardized view, because right now, as you know, there is no standardized way to report to boards. And that's what makes it very confusing when you talk about how financials are reported or how sales are reported. There's a pretty clean structure in how you can present that. But in security, it's still very nuanced, and there isn't. And so I think just having some kind of framework saying, this is the framework we're going to use. And I hope that that gets standardized across the industry at some point, but saying that this is the framework we're going to measure on. Do we all agree on that? And then continuing to show progress against that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, we're a part of that conversation too. And, you know, more standardization would be better, but, you know, in some ways, having so many different components that might drive those conversations leads to more flexibility on the product side as well. So, you know, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword for us. So looking ahead, how do you see the partnership between CISOs and board members evolving over time to meet the ongoing challenges of cybersecurity and regulatory compliance?
I think CISOs, I'm already seeing it and I'm hearing this, but I think CISOs are going to get closer to board members. I think we're going to see more CISOs as board members. It's already happening. I hope to see it happen even more. And I think that will create a real appreciation for what security, like, having the board have a better understanding and infusing the board with security expertise is going to be really important. And I think you will see that the relationship is going to morph over time because there's somebody who's been in that role or is in that role that really understands, can help ask the right questions and educate the rest of the board. In addition to the CISO doing that, I think it's going to strengthen the relationships. Hopefully those CISOs that are sitting on boards are mentoring the board or teaching the board on what that relationship with the CISO needs to be. There's going to be a closer relationship. I think the tone of conversation is not just going to be auditing the data that you show, but really holding other leaders accountable across the company on what they play in terms of security. And I think that we'll see kind of that tone change over time.
Interesting. And this is just one from me because I do so much of this and I get to talk to so many great people. When I read the SEC's new regulations, it seems to me that they're, asking for a filing. They're asking obviously for the 8K stuff, which we all know because it's been around for a while, the incident, the materiality, all of that. But the 10K, for someone who's in risk management software, it's an interesting question. Do you think that boards and C-level executives, are they going to realize, or are they already realizing that cybersecurity and the practices and the governance around it and risk management can be real drivers of equity value for a corporation? Is it looked at that way yet, or can we get on that path anytime soon?
I think it is. I hope it is. Maybe the companies that I think we've seen how breaches can hurt companies, and there's like this general awareness of that. I do think that like for companies who are a little bit more mature and enterprise risk management is a part of their practice, I think for many companies the number one risk is cybersecurity, and there is a concern around that, and there's a concern also because there's an understanding that there's a lack of understanding around cybersecurity at the and I think that's what and some of these rulings are actually going to force, I think, that conversation to happen. And it's like I think CISOs are happy about it in terms of what this might become.
Yeah, and in a sense, do you think it's elevating the role of the CISO to some extent?
I haven't seen the impact of that yet. I hope to. I think that's another very important thing that and we've been talking about this for decades in the security industry. It's like exhausting. That is the reporting structure for CISOs the right one? It is there again, no standardization across organizations around this. When you think about a chief salesperson or a chief finance person, where they report, but for security, that's not the case. Some companies it's still seen as a tech role, and some companies it's seen as a risk role. It just depends. And I hope that standardization does happen. And I don't know. I haven't seen the impact of that. I still see security kind of in different ways at different companies. What I do think is more important is that open line. And I think my mindset has shifted around this too, where does it matter where I report, or does it matter that I know I can call somebody and say, I'm concerned about this right now. I don't feel like the right eyes are on it. And I think feeling empowered in that way is more important than anything else. And then having some instances like that where the CISO does feel supported, that's more important than anything.
Absolutely. Well, Rinki, it's been, as usual, a massive pleasure to talk to you. I always love hearing how you think about these things because you're so close to the action. We'll hopefully get to chat again in the not too distant future.
I look very much forward to it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rinki. Take care. Thanks, Al.